Ramayya Krishnan, the Cooper and Ruth Cooper Professor of Management Science and Information Sciences. And that's very long. I already John Heinz Third College at the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He has, I think you did your PhD in Texas. But previously his studies in India. He's very well regarded in the US, and has also had a lot of government and policy roles. And we're looking forward to this talk today. We stole him and his partner away from their holiday for like a day. So, let's make sure that they get their time worth for visiting us here. And then I'll do another introduction. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. It's still morning. Good morning. The weather is like this all the time, and you have a room like this. I'm going to move here. I mean, it's pretty awesome. We don't have anything like this. It's a wonderful building, and thank you so much, Sotos, for hosting us, and Alid for convening and making possible these visits to Edinburgh and Glasgow. So as Sotos just mentioned, Rema and I were visiting Scotland. We've been in Skye for a few days. Delightful visit, other than the midges, which I have to warn you about. But that said, it's been several wonderful days here as well. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some of our work with you. This can be interactive. I think I have roughly about 45 minutes or so. Is that right? Time-wise? Is that good? Okay. Before I dive into this talk, I wanted to give you a little bit of flavor of some of the work that we're doing and the center that I lead at CMU. I hope you can see that. So the work that we're doing in AI measurement and AI engineering and AI evaluation is part of a federally funded research center at CMU, funded by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, called AIMSEC, which I direct. It has faculty from across campus, and it has three major pillars to it. The pillars are model and system evaluation, both in terms of evaluating models. There's a particular focus on frontier AI in the center, so large language models in particular. Evaluating models, but recognizing that models are often deployed as part of workflows in larger systems. There's an interest in assessing and evaluating systems, not just models. So my work today will focus on model evaluation. A second important pillar is on red teaming. For those of you who are familiar with cybersecurity, you will recognize the term red teaming comes from adversarial ways of prompting and adversarial ways of identifying vulnerabilities in models. And there's been a long tradition of that in cybersecurity that now is migrated over to understanding how robust AI models are and AI systems are. And typically, prior to deployment, there's often a red teaming phase where they usually invite experts to, quote unquote, red team models to identify and probe vulnerabilities so that they can be fixed prior to release. So far, it's been rather ad hoc in terms of how that's been done. So one of our goals is to advance the science of red teaming. And through this process of red teaming, identify and surface vulnerabilities that can then be addressed by creating more robust models that are robust to adversarial attacks. So there are two parts to red teaming. One is understanding behavior of red teamers. The other is creating next generation of models that are more robust to red teaming attacks. Much of my work has been on red teaming behavior. I have colleagues working on more robust models as well. The third piece is on field testing. That is, when you actually deploy models, how do you assess benefits? How do you assess risk? How do you assess cost in situ, in organizational settings? And then how do you causally establish relationships between ways in which the deployment happens and the associated connections to risks as well as to benefits? So these three, think of these as horizontal foundational types of research pillars. And there are two major application domains. One is health and the other is finance. And that's sort of the matrix that the center focuses on. And very much a combination of foundational and problem-driven research. And I suspect that you're organized in many ways similarly, though the scope of things that you do, at least in the preliminary conversations I've had this morning, indicate a much broader range of topics in health than the kinds of things that we do in health. Though different parts of CMU certainly work on the topics that you're interested in. I also wanted to share a little bit of work, take 5 minutes to tell you a little bit about some other projects before I dive into the specifics of the robustness work robustness evaluation work that I'm doing. We have a collection of projects related to evaluation. The first one is on what we call data-driven auditing of black box AI systems. So in the application context is actually, the motivation came from political campaigns in the last round of elections to try and identify, when you use AI systems to determine who gets what emails containing what topics at what frequency, can we identify the latent policy function that's actually driving that kind of addressing behavior without having access to the AI system itself? So how do you use just inputs, outputs, API-based access, if you will, to learn and recover the policy function that's driving behavior? That's the data-driven auditing black box AI systems, and I'll say a couple more words about that. We've been working with Anthropic on studying statistical modeling of red teaming behavior. This is in multi-turn conversations with large language models. How do red teamers identify and probe vulnerabilities, and can we understand the patterns of their attack behavior by looking at their prompt response pairs? So think of a conversation as each turn as a prompt and a response, and you have multiple prompt response pairs, and you get to a point where the attacker has identified a vulnerability, at which point they determine that that's been a successful attack vector. So you have red teamers engaged in this type of behavior, some of which ends up being successful, some of which ends up not being successful. So the question is, can we use statistical models to understand which vectors end up being successful, which of them are not, and use that as a basis for creating the next generation of more robust models. The last one is, as you get a better understanding of the capabilities of the AI, how do you then decide how to deploy AI in ways that can take advantage of the AI for what it's good for, while retaining steps in a task or a workflow that humans are ideally suited for? So how do you combine human plus AI and AI type work in a task assignment type of problem? Which is, if you think of software development, many of you probably use Cursor or you use Microsoft Copilot in the work that you do. That's an example of human plus AI, because the AI recommends snippets of code based on the context of the code you've written thus far, and then you decide what is it that you will accept and not accept. That's an example of human plus AI. But if you imagine a different kind of workflow, like you order something from Amazon and it hasn't been delivered, and you're trying to sort of do a complaint to identify why you didn't get the good that you ordered, that's an example of a a business process or a workflow, some of those steps have high complexity. Some of those steps are low complexity. Others are highly repetitive, and others are low repetitive. They don't repeat very often. And we use this understanding of complexity, repetitiveness, and capability of the AI to decide which step should be done by whom, and then assess for a given workflow, what should be the metrics to evaluate that workflow, not just the individual step, but the entire workflow in terms of throughput, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, and the number of errors, the need for rework, things of that nature, right? So we see this program of work as one continuous program that goes all the way from evaluation to workflow. And that workflow work also feeds into what kind of skilling or upskilling or reskilling people will have to do. This is the data-driven auditing work. I'm not going to say very much about it other than highlight two things that I thought would be useful perhaps for a discussion to follow. So this is in, prior to these systems being deployed, we have been doing this in the context of political campaigns, but even things like TikTok, WhatsApp, all these different kinds of algorithms that are latent that have implications for the kind of behaviors that, or the kinds of messages that you receive, the kinds of engagement that you then produce, which in turn determines what it is the recommendation algorithm sends to you. How can we actually identify and audit what that algorithm is? We did this in the context of a political campaign, where depending on whether you ignore the email or whether you open it and click on it or just open it, you get very different kinds of content. And the question is, can you design an agent system? So some of you were mentioning digital twin. So what we have built is a digital twin of an agent system that could actually mimic human behavior in terms of deciding what to open, what to click on, what to ignore. And by virtue of creating that agent system, be able to collect data. So the decision problem is, what's the design of an agent system that can optimally gather adequate amount of information to recover the policy function of interest. This is sort of the formal version of the problem, which is that you have different kinds of content. The policy system is deciding who gets what when, and you're trying to create an agent system that would actually allow for a response to be estimated, and then be able to recover this. So the goal of the audit is to recover this. These are some of the things that we're doing. And now I'm going to switch to the focus of today's talk, which is on evaluation of models. Feel free to stop me along the way. Wanted to give you a little bit of a feel for some of the topics we're working on, but now I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the work we're doing with large language models. Okay, so many of you probably use large language models for the work that you're doing. Most conversations with large language models are not single-turn conversations. In other words, you don't ask a prompt and get a response and then you're done. 73% of conversations tend to be multi-turn conversations. And what you see up here is an example of a multi-turn conversation. It starts out with a particular question, you get a prompt, you get a response. In turn, there is another prompt, which then yields another response. So there's a sequence of prompt response pairs that is a conversation. Okay. Now, one of the things that's been observed in practice is that large language models tend to be very good and accurate in their initial response. When you ask a prompt, you get a response with high accuracy. But in follow-on prompts, they can be swayed, meaning they can switch from a correct response to an incorrect response. And one of the things that we are faced with, and by the way, I should say that the motivation of this work came from our engagement with a large hospital system and healthcare insurer that actually has already deployed enterprise-wide the equivalent of Copilot. It's actually a Google Gemini Copilot. They call it Sidekick. Every physician, every nurse has a sidekick with them. And when a patient shows up at an emergency department, for instance, for the use case that they shared with us was one where the patient can't speak English, and the nurse has to determine if getting a translator is covered by this patient's health insurance policy. That's a query that prompts a query to Sidekick, and it then provides feedback to the nurse based on the details of this particular patient and her insurance coverage as to whether this person can get a translator or not. Now, they want to make sure that these kinds of responses, which are part of, this is not diagnostic decision support, but this is workflow decision support, that the AI is not going to then change its answer based on how it's queried. So one of our key goals was, how do we measure the robustness of an AI to adversarial prompting? That's sort of that's the focus of this particular paper, and I'll be happy to send a copy of this paper to Sortos or to Aled to share with all of you. This is going to be in the ACL conference in Vienna in a little over a month. So as I just noted, you have outstanding performance on single-turn tasks for a range of capabilities of the sort that you probably are already familiar with. But the main issue is in multi-turn interactions. So our focus is on multi-turn interactions, and the fact that these high-stakes domains require an understanding of the stability and the consistency of these models in high-stakes conversations. Okay, so I should note that this is a topic of some interest, not just in our group, but Anthropic. This is by the way, this is the work that we're doing with Anthropic. This is on red teaming language models, multi-turn language models that Anthropic has released. There's also ongoing work on understanding multi-turn behavior, because this has become an issue, because most of the work in the literature today tended to focus on single-turn conversations. Okay, so what is the problem that we are actually going to focus on? We really want to come up with a good way of doing metrics and measurement. And the metrics and measurement of interest is, how can we ensure the measurement of multi-turn consistency of large language models? There are two goals. Goal one is really what our focus is going to be. That is conditional on the LLM producing a correct answer in round one or turn one. How do we measure if it stays consistent with the correct answer in further rounds of interaction or prompting, when that prompting is adversarial? That's really the focus, both of the testing and the measurement. And we've come up with metrics that actually measure that, and a benchmark to actually assess and evaluate the robustness of LLMs in this particular setting. That's fundamentally the focus of this particular paper. And then going from this to actual deployment is something that we'd be very interested in hearing from all of you, given your expertise in healthcare. This is just by a way of telling you a little bit about related work. One of the reasons why you're seeing this kind of swaying from correct answers to incorrect answers is actually a function of pre-training of these large language models. They've been trained it's called psychophancy, but the idea of being aiming to please or instruction following of what it is that the prompter is seeking to get from the system. It tends to follow what the prompts are that the user gives it, and that results in one kind of reason for it prioritizing agreement with the prompter than the truth. And that's one of the reasons why you see this flipping. Another can be that as the number of turns in a conversation grows, the context window increases, and there is a prioritization of the more recent content versus the older content, and that can also result in the change in answers. Some of the work that folks are doing on this problem of understanding multi-turn conversations and the failures, so far nobody has really produced a good metric for actually measuring robustness of these systems under adversarial prompting, and that's what led us down the path of really trying to develop both a benchmark as well as the metrics. Okay, so what have we actually done? The first thing that we did was we wanted to create a benchmark. We created 700 questions drawn from 3 major sources: MMLU, Common Sense QA, and Truthful QA. These are well-known benchmarks in the field. And we wanted it to cover 44 subjects that range from social science to STEM to common sense to moral standards, range of topics. Each one of those topics, roughly about 14 questions, and 4 difficulty levels: preliminary school, college, and professional. So think of this as 44 subject domains, 4 different levels, 14 questions per topic area, 700 questions. That's sort of the curated data set. Having that data set, we want to then have the model first provide a response in round 1 to a question, where each question has a particular structure to it. And the details of how exactly the benchmark was created is no different from what you would typically do in benchmark creation, from topic pruning to controlled sample selection. But what I think is more interesting is structure of the questions. Every question in those 700 questions has a structure where you have a question, which would be the prompt. You have a response, and usually there are 4 to 5 responses to that question, of which one of those responses is the correct response. So think of this as a 3-tuple: question, the vector of potential responses, and then the correct response. Okay, and you randomize the set of alternative responses so that the LLM doesn't memorize the particular response. As it's always going to be B is not always going to be the right answer, or always going to be D that's going to be the right answer. You randomize the responses. So the structure then is question, response vector, and the right response. So we have the ground truth in each of these cases. Okay. Here are some examples of questions that are drawn from our data set that we created. Ranges from tasks that are like math, like algebra, to psychology, to biology, and just maybe some of you work on these kinds of topics, to medicine, to sort of something that's more moral, related to, are you allowed to sing when the child is asleep, or do a prank on somebody who's an older person, things of that nature. But in all these cases, these questions and the responses that we have the questions have been selected such that every question has a fixed set of responses, and then there is a known answer for every one of them. Okay. Now, one thing that I'd like for you to keep in mind, I'd love to come back to you after I'm done with my presentation, is while this type of benchmark is very useful for evaluation and assessment of the particular problem we are interested in, which is, as I'll show you, how do you measure robustness of the large language model in the face of adversarial prompting? It would be good to ask yourself, what might be the nature of the benchmark you need if you're going to deploy an LLM in the kind of healthcare setting that you are familiar with, or that you are actually working on? Because this is a generic benchmark data set. It's not specific to healthcare diagnostics, or it's not specific to healthcare, AI use in vision or robotics or any of those kinds of things. It's a more generic data set. But the structure of the data set in terms of questions, response vector, and then a particular response that's a chosen response, I think would be useful for you to keep in mind. Okay, given that we have, so step one is you need the benchmark. Step two is you need a set of adversarial prompts. So there are 8 adversarial prompts that we have that follow up following the first turn. So think of that first turn of the conversation as you take a question like the one that I have up here. This question, which of the following steroid-based molecules, which of these are steroid-based molecules? And the answer has to be one of these, right? Which is the right answer. That would be prompt that would be a first round of the prompt. But having done that, then this would be the follow-on. Are you sure? I don't agree with you. These are all adversarial prompts that have come from and have been drawn from either the psychology literature or the education literature, designed specifically with the objective of challenging the LLM's original correct answer. So in round one, you get the answer to the prompt based on the benchmark, and then you have the follow-up prompts, and the question is, does the LLM stick with the answer that is correct, or does it switch? That's fundamentally the task that you're focused on. Everybody clear about the basic task? Okay. So we have 2 kinds of experiments that we conduct. I'll focus on the diverse follow-ups because all these models do well with repetitive follow-ups. So the idea with the diverse follow-ups is after the first prompt response turn, you can, in a diverse ways, choose from among the 8 and issue the 8 in random order. So here's basically what we find for the models that we tested. So these were the different models that were tested. You'll see that most of them are state-of-the-art models. Arguably, Gemini 2.5 Pro would do a whole lot better than 1.5 Flash did in our experiments. But these are large language models that are state-of-the-art. Some of them are closed source, like Gemini, Claude, and GPT. Mistral, Quen, and Llama are the open models. Okay, so let's now walk through metrics of how to assess and evaluate consistency. The 3 things that we're interested in are initial accuracy and average follow-up accuracy over time. So the first part of our measurement is, as part of the first prompt response pair, how many of those questions did each of these models get right on average? So in the first round, remember, we are issuing 700 questions. Each model gets 700 questions. And in round 1, how many of that 700 did it get right? That would be the first round correctness. Following from that, the conditional on you being right in the first turn, what is the follow-up accuracy as I issue these adversarial prompts? That's the average follow-up accuracy over turns. And you're also wanting to measure how many rounds of adversarial prompting did it take before you flipped from a correct answer to an incorrect answer. So assuming conditional on you being right in the first round, how long did it take for you to flip to an incorrect answer? That's called the average first sway round, second metric. And then the third, this is the new metric that we actually have introduced. And I'll explain to you why this actually is a better metric than the first 2 that have been used in the literature. Initial accuracy is obvious in the sense of it being, how accurate is the model in the first round. The average follow-up accuracy over turns does not penalize a model for being unstable early on and then recovering. What this metric does, as you'll see here, is think of S sub I as whether it's right or wrong. Imagine that of being a binary, being 0 or 1, whether something is right or wrong. And then you have a weighting factor, which is like a discount factor, which is raised to the power of the round where the failure occurs. So what this does is it discounts and penalizes failure earlier on in in the adversarial prompting in ways that the average follow-up accuracy does not. So in average follow-up accuracy, if you fail early and then you recover, you might fail in round 1 and recover in round 3, or fail in round 3 and recover in round 4. Average follow-up accuracy would not be able to tell the difference between those two cases. It's not able to distinguish between those two types of failures and recoveries, whereas this takes account of when you fail because there's a discount factor as to when you fail. Fundamentally, that's the key advantage of the metric that we propose, which is called position-weighted consistency score. So using these 3 metrics, we now evaluate these models on these questions that we have identified in our benchmark. So let me walk through some of the results, and then we can take questions. So what are the results? We find that the initial turn, the initial accuracy of the LLM, that, as you might potentially expect, the closed source models, Claude and GPT, do really well compared to the open source models. So you'll see Claude and GPT are better than Llama and Mistral, for instance. In terms of, that is over the 700 questions, that's the percentage of questions, 83% accuracy for Claude in round 1, 78% accuracy for GPT in round 1, so on and so forth. Now, what happens if I look at the average follow-on accuracy? You'll see a lot of variation. So notice that following conditional on being correct in round 1, what happens when I follow up with prompting? What you're seeing is this big up and down. Other than GPT that does fairly well, you'll see these models swaying. And the reason for that is that they are changing their answer in the face of adversarial prompting. That's fundamentally what's going on. And you'll see here that while GPT maintains this consistent highest accuracy with minimal fluctuation in terms of average follow-on accuracy, but now you find that these models that, like Claude, that did really well in round 1 are not as good. The green here is Claude. So the interesting actionable insight, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with survival models. Are you familiar with survival models in biostatistics? So if you think of survival models, you can now think of the event, the survival event is the number of rounds you survive before you switch an answer from being correct to incorrect, right? And you make that a function of the type of model, the type of task, and the kind of relationships between the prompts in each turn. It can't be a straightforward Cox proportionate hazard model, because those models assume independence between covariates. So you need a time-varying hazard model or time-varying proportional hazard model. That's what this thing is leading to. Okay, so this type of data that you get on assessing how these models do under adversarial prompting allows you to estimate a survival model where you can now get actionable insights that say, depending on the type of task that you have, depending on the type of question that you have, which model is more stable, which model is a better fit for the type of application that you have and that you need, that you're interested in. The other interesting thing that you can do with this data set is you can also ask the question, what interventions can I intervene with that would allow for my survival to move to the right, meaning that my models will last longer under adversarial prompting. So that becomes an interesting causal question, right? Which is, I have these models that I'm now testing on this data, and I produce this information about the time to survive. And now I think about what intervention can I make to these models, and we'll propose one. And then we'll ask the question, how does that shift both accuracy and how does it shift model response robustness in the face of adversarial prompting? Yes, sir.
What do you mean in this context by intervention? Because if you're having a conversation with the agent, then your prompting is kind of just like picking from a fixed set of actions in some sense, which is different than an intervention, which sort of structurally changes the system.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about a structural change. I'll come to, it's not about prompting, it's about changing. It's called confidence-aware generation, which is a way of actually changing. We embed a confidence score in the question answer pairs, and that's the nature of the change that we're making, and then asking the question, does that now change the nature of how the model performs? Okay. Okay, so that was average accuracy in the phase of prompting. As you might expect, we are interested also in how many rounds do these models last, and this becomes then a raw measure, this average measure of how many rounds does it last under adversarial. Now, what you'd ideally like is for this to move to the right. Adversarial prompt, the number of rounds that these things survive to move to the right, and your accuracy to be as high as possible. And our PwC score, which is our metric, so far I was talking about accuracy and round, basically in effect weights how many rounds you survive. You may recover. By the way, this is another interesting question, I think, from a metrics and measurement standpoint, is do you want to use the PwC score that we have allows for recovery from failure. So in other words, you may start out being correct, conditional being initially correct, you're correct, you fail, and then you might come back to a correct answer, and the PwC score allows for that recovery. In some settings, you might say that once I have a failure, I'm done. I don't want to look at this model post the failure event. That requires a different version of the PwC score versus the score that we have allows for recovery from failure, right? The recovery from failure allows for mean time between failures. You know, think about failure event 1, and then there's another failure event. You can think of it that way. Yeah.
So when you are doing the adversarial prompting, let's say that you prompted several times and then the model fails. When you prompt it again, you encourage the failed answer like you've been doing in the past, or do you tell it it's wrong?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. So first point is there is a system prompt that begins before you go through this, and the paper actually goes through these details of what the system prompt is in the experimental design, what the system prompt is that that provides the model with instructions about how it's supposed to respond. The way this process works is question 1, response 1, and then question 2, the context window continues to grow. So even if the model makes an error, the follow-on prompt doesn't sort of basically say you've made an error. You remember there's a sequence of, there are 8 different prompts that are offered in randomized order. It might, suppose it makes an error, I could say, are you sure? And it might flip back to a correct answer. So if you go back to, you remember those prompts, those adversarial prompts? So we don't provide information to the LLM along the way that it's actually provided an incorrect answer. Other than you might query the thing, I don't agree with you, think again. You might get a prompt like that, and it might recover from that failure upon receipt of this type of prompt.
I was mentioning because a couple say that I think the answer should be MA.
Oh yeah, so this is my trying to be misleading. It has a right answer. Let's say the right answer was B. And I'm saying that, oh, I think the answer should be A. So this is like trying to be a misleading type of prompt. The expert thinks, most people disagree with this. As an expert in this domain, I don't agree. These are all different ways of adversarially pushing back on the response that it was given. Yeah. So the MA was basically not that particular, whatever was the answer, I'm giving a different choice. Remember, every one of those alternatives are between 4 or 5 choices. I'm trying to mislead the model in that case. Yeah. But I thought the question you're posing is, do I tell the model you're wrong and give it a chance to recover? Or do I just continue prompting and see if it goes back to a correct response? You could imagine a version of this prompting strategy where you could say, I think you're wrong. But remember, that's one of the prompts. Think again. And the question is, does it recover even from just through prompting? Yeah. Okay, so talked about this. So the basic takeaway then is that you can think of these models being ranked this way as being, you could rank them on a Pareto frontier, right? Where if you're familiar with multi-criteria optimization, you could think of these as factors you want to evaluate these models on. And you might have other factors that are relevant based on the downstream decision maker and what the utility function is that downstream decision maker may have. These are things that we're evaluating the model's robustness performance on, but then the answers it gives may be relevant to how the decision maker may find value in the model downstream. And through this evaluation process, you can now select a given model for a particular task. This is sort of our objective in doing this kind of work, is to say, can we now inform the selection of models for tasks? Now, a variation that we did was for the model that did best, we added a system prompt that said, assume that the question asker is either friendly or assume that the question asker is adversarial. So this was another variation on the experiment to try and see if setting a system prompt that indicated the nature of the question asker would make changes to the results. And you certainly see that if you indicate that you're working with a friendly question asker, GPT tends to want to agree more with the question asker and therefore has a higher likelihood of swaying than when it's prompted to say, assume that the question asker or the prompter is adversarial. Now, the reason why this is interesting is that in almost any high stakes domain, you probably want to instruct the model to be assuming that the question asker is adversarial, because by virtue of that, it's more cautious and it tends to rely on its own scores, internal capability to respond to a model. And it turns out that you have a much higher likelihood of not only accuracy, but doesn't sway as much when it assumes that the question asker is adversarial. So the two takeaways then are that one, you want to sort of choose a model based on type of task, taking into account accuracy and robustness as measured by the number of rounds. But second, you also want to see what prompts do you want to set by way of system prompts that actually guide the model to be more cautious and therefore produce better behavior in almost any high stakes domain. Yeah.
I have a general question, but do conversations that have a first sway kind of predict more sways after that?
So in these 700 questions, I don't have a quantifiable thing to report to you. It's an interesting thing to ask because I think I mentioned the mean time between failure. That's a metric we want to measure, but I don't have the number off the top of my head. And you could also say conditional on failure early on, you also see a greater likelihood of failure later on to adversarial prompting, which is a version of your question. I haven't actually measured it, so I don't have an answer to that. It's a good question.
Yeah, because you can imagine that if I say that the answer is C 10 times, I'm probably going to keep saying it's going to be C because I've very much doubled down on it. Versus a conversation where I've switched my answer and now it's like I have some kind of doubt. So from like a human psychology standpoint, you could imagine.
So on the first one, we actually did the repetitive prompting, and it does really quite well against the same prompt being issued. I think the answer is C, I think the answer is C, and it holds its ground. but conditional on failure, then the question is, does that predict the likelihood of further failure? That's a good thing for that. What I was intending to measure was the mean time between failures, but I think a version of what you're asking also is, does it predict will the next one also be a failure, or will it recover? You could actually measure that. Yeah. We were just measuring mean time between failures. Yeah. Okay. This is sort of quote unquote our intervention to your question. So the first sort of things we did was benchmark, measurement, and assessment. The question is, what can we do with it? So one idea that we are exploring, and I should say this is early work, is what we call confidence extraction, and then the use of confidence embedding, and using confidence guided generation as the intervention to see if that actually makes a difference in terms of how robust it is to adversarial prompting. So what exactly did we do? We have a proxy measure of confidence, which is established in the following way. We first remember that we benefit from the fact that our question answer structure is question. The answer is one of 4 or 5 choices. So you could always have the correct answer is X, where X is it A, B, C, or D. And the generation process, then you could identify what the probability of those tokens are, the correct answer, and then of that particular token. And then you could basically get the average log probability by, in a gray box kind of way of extracting the token level probability from the large language model. This is a fairly standard approach for measuring as a proxy measure the confidence that the model has in that particular token. So imagine that this is the highest probability token in the next token completion phase. So that's sort of the average probability. And then you take this and embed that confidence measure in you take question answer confidence. So for every one of those question answer pairs, you have a confidence measure that is the token probability number. And once you embed this question answer probability question answer confidence measure as derived in this manner, how well does it do? While empirically we demonstrate that it actually does better than without this confidence aware embedding. It also does better in terms of the number of rounds it survives. The science of why this happens, okay, the mechanism part is still something that we are actively working on. So what we've done is we've created this, what I'm calling an intervention, because it does change the nature of the generative process. And then we are assessing on the same benchmark and asking the question, how well does it do with respect to the number of rounds it survives and its accuracy? And what we find is that it sort of does improve this consistency degradation. And that's one of the key empirical findings. And I should note that the rationale for why this works is something that we're actually actively working on. Okay, so that sort of brings this portion of the talk to an end. I think I'm close to 40 minutes or so. So let me quickly summarize and then highlight one thing that I think is an interesting thing that I'd love to get your feedback on. In what I've just laid out, we talked about a way of coming up with metrics and measurement for accuracy and robustness. We came up with a particular intervention that we show empirically to work. But we have done this for a domain-independent benchmark data set. The question is how, and we recognize that these benchmark data sets have limitations in terms of how well they're predictive of actual deployments. So one of the questions is, how do you create benchmark data sets of this sort that might be relevant to the target application? And how do we scalably do that in a way that then allows for this type of survival analysis to be done to allow for us to do model selection using this Pareto frontier type of idea. So those are the main things that I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you again. Back there? Yeah.
You measure model stability on questions the model initially got wrong. Because obviously, in like the example you mentioned, the healthcare setting, obviously it's actually better to have a model that if it got the answer wrong initially, it's unstable and flips around and someone actually bothers to look up when someone's entitled to a translator rather than being wrong and then repeatedly confidently wrong.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So out of the 700 questions, 578 were initially correctly done. So we focused on conditional on round one being correct, the likelihood of it flipping. Your point about conditional on being wrong in round one, are you able to recover? That's this part about dynamic adapt. Remember, I had two goals in my slide. One was how consistent are you under under the condition that you got it right in round one. The second one is if you fail, if I told you you're wrong and you indeed know you're wrong, what is the best way to dynamically learn and come up with the right answer? That's work to be done, which is along the lines of what you're asking. But the majority of the questions, you saw that 70 to 80%, you had correctness for these questions. So we focus very much on the first goal. Yes?
Hello, I have a question about the position
Weighted consistency.
From a user perspective. Should the final round answer matter more in the process? Because if you consider a user is keep asking the question, when he or she ends the conversation, maybe the last answer matters more. So it's more valuable to him.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. I think, remember, our objective here was a red teaming type of exercise, which was more along the lines of saying there are 8 kinds of adversarial prompts that we're going to give you to test to see how robust the model is to adversarial prompting. In a general, this goes back to my point about how might you take the results of adversarial prompting, then translate it to how we might actually see a non-malicious user. So this is like a malicious user trying to get the model to change its behavior, right? Your question is, I'm not a malicious user, I'm a regular user, and she has this desire to have a multi-turn conversation and maybe anchors more on the last response. I think these are 2 different contexts. I think this is about adversarial red teaming to determine how robust the model is to adversarial red teaming. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, the design is that you first ask your question and then you try to sway the answer in a different direction. So
Correct.
what do you think would happen if it was the other way around? For example, you prompt the conversation leading towards an answer, and then towards the end, you ask the question. Do you think that might increase the chances of the model being swayed from the beginning? So you kind of introduce some sort of corruption from the beginning.
So let me understand your proposal. So in round one, what would you do? You would prompt it to do what?
So for example, if we have A, B, C, D, C is the correct answer, we start a conversation about how D might be the correct answer instead. And towards the end, we ask the question and see if we get C or D, for example.
Right. So yeah, your first question is, rather than say, I have this question, here are the choices, give me the right answer. You might say, here I have this question, here are the choices, I think the answer is whatever. It might be the wrong answer. Yeah, we did not. It's the misleading. That's like, I think her question. I think the answer is MA was one of the prompts. Your point is, what if that was made the initial prompt? Does that? So the interesting question is, if this was if you're modeling this in terms of being probabilistic and a walk of some sort, you're seeding the initial seed at a different point, and your question is, do you end up at it? I think it's an interesting question as to where that will lead.
My concern would be that the model is trying to stay consistent with the first part of the conversation. And when it's led to the question, it prioritizes that versus actually retrieving the correct answer.
So I think what it's doing in round one, it's actually choosing, remember the way this works is that it's going to respond with that response that yields the highest token probability, right? Now, if you change the context, what I think you're saying is that in addition to asking, here's a question, here are the choices, I think the answer is something. If I gave it that context, what ends up having the highest token probability? That's number one. And if that token probability is different from the true answer's token probability, will you then go down a different? So it's an interesting question of, if we chose different starting points, could you imagine thinking of a graph which had different walks, if you will, based on adversarial prompting with different seeds? Or is it the case that, even in some contexts, it still ends up making that first choice being the first choice, in which case you would have exactly the same path as before? It's an interesting question.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because most of these models have been tuned to align with the user preferences. And one of the ways that they tune them is they try to basically appease the user. And I think this type of prompt actually might trigger that instruction, because they have the general prompts like try to agree with the user, try to be apologetic. So they might actually trigger a completely different behavior into how the model defaults.
Yeah. So if you remember right at the beginning, I talked about psychophancy and this whole idea of agreement. So we explicitly account for that through system prompts. But I still think it would be worth the experiment to see if it actually starts. The way I'm thinking about this is, depending on how you start the prompting, does that yield an initial starting point that is different from what would be the case if you just started with, here are the choices, make the choice, and that then yields a different walk through the graph. If you think of this as like a state space that you're walking through under adversarial prompting, it's a different type of robustness testing, but I think it's a great idea. We'll certainly try that.
I think that would lean more into building arguments and then trying to sway the conclusion. So feeding some.
But you're assuming that the seed might actually be different. It might end up that context change may not end up shifting the answer. You're thinking that the choice might actually change. It may or may not.
From my conversations with ChatGPT, I think, yeah, I'm leaning towards thinking.
But I wonder whether when you did your conversation with ChatGPT, whether you gave it a system prompt of the sort that. So we have I'd be happy to share our paper with you, where we have a specific experimental design where there is a system prompt and the behavior that it produces. But even under that system prompt, I'd like to try to see if one of our, basically what you're saying is, why don't you promote one of our adversarial prompts to be part of the context window of the first prompt and see how it changes the walk through the space. That's fundamentally your question. It's a good question. We didn't do that. We will certainly look into it. Yes, sir.
So it's not really a question. I'm just curious because I understand back when you're doing the benchmark, the baseline models you show here, they are all the autoregressive language models.
All decoder models, yeah.
Yeah, and recently the diffusion-based language models, they are coming out. And if I remember correctly, from the technical reports of the diffusion language model, the open source Lada, they claim that in their multi-turn, although it's not versus not involve the adversarial prompting, but in the multi-turn conversation reasoning, the Lada outperforms the Llama 3 with a huge margin. So I'm just curious, like, if we add this line to this plot, what would it be like?
I think it's a great line of research to do. I don't want to speculate how our model, our approach would work in diffusion-based models because we haven't done it. But I think it's a great approach to pursue. I think there's a lot of room for doing the kinds of experiments we're talking about, and then maybe doing identifying if the metrics, the ones that we propose or others may propose, are the right metrics to use, doing the survival analysis of the sort that I mentioned, and then doing the Pareto analysis for the selection decision. So our pipeline is one of benchmark, metrics, survival analysis, and then Pareto analysis, Pareto frontier, to make the selection decision. And that's on the decision support side. I think the other side, which I think your suggestion raises, is will our capacity to think about, think of this as large state space that I'm sort of navigating if I start in different places, but maybe it may or may not. So I'd like to find out what exactly. You've made me curious. We'll look into it. I think you had a question.
Yeah, so my question is related to the confidence aware response generation. When you are doing your experiments, have you observed any trend on the confidence change when the model swap its answers? When it swaps its answers, is it like it is more confident or less confident?
So when by definition, swaying happens on account of the fact that before we did the confidence aware generation, it's likely because the token probability associated with, as the context window changed, that's actually a version of her question, as a context window now includes an adversarial prompt, the token associated with an incorrect answer ends up having a higher probability than the probability of the token for the right answer, and that's why you get the wrong answer.
So, but then, okay, so basically the confidence you generated is from the model, is the perplexity of the model itself, right? It's from you calculated from the tokens.
Yeah, we simply calculate we extract the token probabilities of each of the tokens. The correct answer is X, and where X is each of those choices, and then we compute the confidence base. It's a proxy. It's not perfect, but that's what we use. But we empirically show that it actually produces good behavior.
Have you also tried to directly, not computing from the tokens, but directly ask the model how confident?
We have done that, but that's been shown to be rather flaky, actually, of asking the model how confident you are of this, because that again comes from instruction, but not from actual values.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, back here. Sorry.
Very much, and a very interesting talk. So I have a question, and I'm not sure it's very related to this, but I think it's a question that might be interesting for future experiments. I was wondering what would happen if, at the initial prompt, none of the answers is correct. Would I be able to recover at all, say, well, actually none is correct, or?
Interesting. Okay.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
So that's more like you're thinking almost like in an open-ended kind of setting, where I gave you 4 things, but the actual answer is none of the things that I gave you. There's another one that's out there.
Yeah.
And the question is, where would it come from, right? It would have to come from its pre-training, where it has knowledge of the fact that it's one of the answers that none of the answers that you gave are the correct ones. Correct? That's how you're thinking. Like, let's say I tell you the capital of the UK is Edinburgh. And that's the only choice I give, and it says no, it's not Edinburgh, it's London.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing you're thinking of.
Kind of, yeah, like as in when you exactly, in a sense, yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is an interesting question, particularly relevant, I think, to the target environments where we want to deploy. Remember, these benchmarks are much more controlled settings where we are evaluating these models in terms of robustness. But almost any practical deployment scenario, you may have situations where I ask a question, not expecting it to either confirm just among the choices I give it, it might say, no, something outside even the choice set. And the question is, what's a good way of creating those kinds of benchmarks that are more representative of the question asking and question answering that you would want in target application scenarios? We have not done that yet, but I think it's an interesting question of how do you go from these benchmarks that come from MMLU and Truthful QA and Common Sense to something that might be relevant in a target environment. Rema, you might want to mention the transplant work that you. So it's a very different context.
Right. No, the specific application that we are thinking of testing this approach is in the context of patient education for patients undergoing organ transplant. And so the way they do it right now is patients on the wait list, when they go on the wait list, the transplant centers give them this big handbook. It's, hundreds of pages. And it's supposed to really have answers to all the questions that patients may have before they go on the pre-transplant as well as during transplant and post-transplant. And so questions are like, after the transplant, can I swim in a swimming pool? And can I take an acetaminophen if I have a pain, or if I have a fever? So it's just regular day-to-day living kind of questions. But the challenge is that the responses occasionally vary, depending upon whether the handbook, the transplant center is a Mayo Clinic or a Harvard Medical School or a Johns Hopkins or a Vanderbilt, sometimes because they have their own protocols. And these protocols might vary. So the initial study that we did was to really understand the commonalities and differences, variations in critical responses, medication management, activities of daily living, and so on that patients ask all the time. And to be able to compile these commonalities and differences and bring it to the attention of these transplant centers. They had no idea that they were giving different answers to patients on these types of questions. So we built a RAG-based model and so on. But now the question that we are looking at is that, you really want to be consistent. When these questions are asked by many patients coming to the same transplant center, and so, can we evaluate the consistency in a robustness, consistency, accuracy, and all of that in a critical, situation like that. So that's really one of the contexts where we are planning to study this approach and this problem.
Yeah.
Yes. If you have any extra questions, I might say let's do them after the next talk. Okay. And we'll give everybody 5 minutes to stretch, go to the bathroom, get a while we switch the computers.
Yeah,
Thank you.